There is a specific kind of fear that only a cemetery produces. And it is not the fear of death itself. Most of us have made some kind of peace with the concept. The fear of dying is different from the fear of what's already died. What a cemetery produces is something more specific. It's the fear of the boundary, the very thin, very specific, very permeable boundary between where the living stand and where the dead were put. You are standing on ground that was dug open and closed again. You are standing on ground where something ended, where a body stopped, where every conversation and memory and unfinished business of a specific person was committed to the earth beneath your feet. And in the Appalachian Mountains, where the ground is 480 million years old and the oldest cemeteries have been receiving the dead since before this was a country, that boundary is unreliable in specific ways. In ways that 3 people discovered recently. In mountain cemeteries in West Virginia and Tennessee and Kentucky, when the ground did something that ground is not supposed to do. Or when a photograph showed something that wasn't there. Or when a sound came from the old section at night. These are not gentle stories. These are the ones that stay. Let's begin. I want to tell you what I thought when I first saw it. My first thought was that I'd gone to the wrong grave, because the alternative, the thing my brain was presenting as a possibility and immediately rejecting, was that my mother's headstone had rotated 90 degrees in the 6 years since we'd buried her. And that's not a thing that happens. That's not a thing that can happen. So I told myself I was at the wrong grave. I walked the row. I checked the stones on either side. I was at the right grave. The stone had moved. My name is Corbett. I'm 44. My mother, Doreen, died 6 years ago. She's buried in a family cemetery on a hillside in West Virginia. The same cemetery where her parents are buried and her grandparents before them, a private family plot on land that's been in the family since the mid-1800s. I visit twice a year, spring and fall. In 6 years of twice-yearly visits, I have stood at that grave 12 times. On the 12th visit, the stone was facing a different direction. Let me be specific about what I mean by that. A headstone is placed with its face, the inscribed side, pointing away from the head of the grave toward the person approaching from the pathway. This is standard, this is consistent. Every stone in every cemetery I have ever visited follows this orientation. It is how headstones work. My mother's stone, which I had watched placed with its face toward the pathway at her burial, was now turned 90 degrees. The face of the stone, with her name and her dates, was pointing toward the adjacent grave plot, facing left, toward the grave of her mother, my grandmother, who had been buried there 11 years before. The stone was facing my grandmother's grave. I stood at the grave for a long time. I looked at the base of the stone, the buried portion, where the stone meets the ground. The ground around the base was undisturbed. Not recently disturbed and resettled, undisturbed. No evidence of the digging that would be required to rotate a headstone, which requires freeing the buried base, rotating and resetting. That process disturbs ground significantly. The ground was untouched. The stone had been moved without disturbing the ground at its base. I looked for any evidence of how this could have happened. A lever, pry marks on the stone's sides, some mechanical means of rotating without digging. Nothing. The stone was simply facing a different direction than when it had been placed. I called my Uncle Steph that evening. Steph is my mother's brother. He's been the primary caretaker of the family plot for 30 years. He knows every stone, every grave, every detail of the cemetery's condition. I described what I'd found. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "How far did it turn?" Not "Are you sure?" Not "That's impossible." Not "Let me come check." How far did it turn? I said, "About 90 degrees. It's facing Grandma's grave now." He said, "That's what it did before." I said, "What do you mean before?" He said, "Corbett, this is the 3rd time." Steph told me the history. The first time was 4 years after my grandmother was buried. So roughly 35 years ago, my grandfather came to visit her grave and found the stone had rotated, facing toward the empty plot beside her, the plot that would eventually be where my grandfather was buried. My grandfather had called Steph in a panic, Steph had come, confirmed it, had the stone professionally reset by a monument company. The monument company had found no explanation for the movement. The base showed no evidence of disturbance. The second time was 11 years later, 2 years after my grandfather was buried beside my grandmother. Someone visiting the graves found my grandmother's stone had rotated again, this time facing my grandfather's adjacent grave. Again reset. Again no explanation. And now, 6 years after my mother's burial, her stone had turned to face her mother's grave. 3 stones, 3 movements, the same cemetery, across 35 years. Each time, a stone turning to face another family member's grave, toward whoever was most recently buried beside them. I asked Steph whether he'd ever investigated the history of it, whether anyone had ever looked into whether this was documented elsewhere. He said he'd asked around quietly over the years. He said he'd found one person with direct knowledge, a county records clerk named Miss Falk, who had been in her position for decades and had an institutional memory of the county's cemeteries that went back further than the records themselves. He'd asked her years ago, after the second incident. He told me what she'd said. She'd said, "I've heard of it in a few of the old family plots, not often, but it's not unknown." He'd asked what caused it. She'd said, "Nobody knows the mechanism. What people say is that the stones turn toward whatever the person most wants to be facing." He'd said, "The person is dead." She'd said, "Yes." He'd said, "Dead people don't want things." She'd said, "Don't they? I had the stone professionally reset after my visit." The same monument company Steph had used twice before, different personnel now, younger men who hadn't been there for the previous 2 incidents. They reset it correctly, faced toward the pathway, the standard orientation. They filed a maintenance report noting the unexplained rotation. The foreman, when I asked about it, said he'd seen similar reports from 2 other cemeteries in the county over his career. He said it had never been explained to his satisfaction. I said, "What's your best guess?" He said, "Ground movement, freeze-thaw cycles, soil shift." I said, "Does soil shift rotate a stone 90 degrees without disturbing the surface?" He said, "No." He said it directly, not evasively, just no. I said, He said, "So I don't have a good answer for you. I visited twice since the reset. Both times the stone was correctly oriented. I don't know when it will turn again. I don't know which grave it will face when it does. My father is still living. There is a plot reserved for him beside my mother. And I think about Miss Falk's words every time I visit that hillside. The stones turn toward whatever the person most wants to be facing. My mother, wherever she is, whatever wanting means from where she is either waiting to see my grandmother, or she turned toward my grandmother's grave because she could already see her and was pointing the rest of us toward where she'd found her. I don't know which. What I know is that the stone faces the pathway now, and every spring and every fall I check that it hasn't moved. And every spring and every fall when it hasn't moved, I feel 2 things simultaneously: relief and the specific loneliness of a stone that is still pointing in the direction the living put it, rather than the direction she chose. I've been doing cemetery preservation photography for 4 years, and I need you to understand what that means in terms of how carefully I look at the scenes I'm photographing. Cemetery preservation is precise work. You're documenting stones that may be unreadable in 10 years. You need every inscription captured, every surface detail. You need the image to be a record that someone could use in 50 years to understand exactly what was on that stone. You look at every frame carefully before you move to the next stone. You're not shooting casually. I look at my photographs more carefully than most people look at anything, which is why it took me 3 full seconds to understand what I was seeing when I pulled up the first image from the session. 3 seconds. And then I understood, and I put my laptop down, and I said, "Sven, my name is Odette. I'm 37. Sven is my documentation partner. We've been working on Appalachian cemetery preservation together for 2 years." The session in question was at a family cemetery in eastern Tennessee, a remote site, hand-built iron fence, 47 stones spanning roughly 1,820 to 1,940, accessed by a 15-minute walk through forest from the nearest road. We had permission from the family trust that maintained the property. We had been there before, a different section of the same county. We were familiar with the terrain and the work. We arrived at 9 a.m. on a clear September morning. We spent 4 hours documenting moving systematically through the cemetery. I photographed. Sven managed the transcription log. We were alone. I want to be as clear about this as I can be. In 4 hours in a small cemetery, accessible only by a narrow forest trail, we saw no one. We heard no one. There was no vehicle at the road access point when we arrived, and none when we left. The trail showed no fresh footprints going in when we arrived. We were alone. I have 47 photographs. Every single one of them contains a figure I did not see. I pulled up the first photograph at home that evening. Standard documentation image, a stone from the 1842nd's Good Morning Light, the inscription clearly readable. And behind the stone, perhaps 20 feet back, standing between two other stones, a figure, tall, still, dark clothing, facing my camera. I stared at it. I thought, this is a person I didn't see. I didn't look behind every stone I photographed. Someone was in the cemetery during our session, and I didn't notice them. I thought that for about 3 seconds. And then I opened the second photograph. Same figure, different position, further into the cemetery, standing between different stones, but the same height, the same posture, the same stillness. I opened the third photograph. There, behind the stone, same figure, closer than in the second photograph. I called Sven. I said, open your copy of today's session. Look at any photograph. Silence for a moment, then, Odette. I said, yes. He said, is that someone we didn't see? I said, look at the next photograph. He was quiet for a moment. He said it moved. I said, yes. He said, to a different position. I said, yes. He said, is it in all of them? I said, I've checked the first 12. It's in all 12. He said, I'm coming over. We went through all 47 photographs together. Systematically, laid out in session order, on my laptop, the figure was in every single one. We mapped its position across the 47 frames. In photograph 1, the far end of the cemetery, approximately 60 feet from the stone I'd been photographing. In photographs 2 through 8, progressively closer, moving through the cemetery, always between stones, always facing the camera. In photograph 9, approximately 40 feet from the stone. In photograph 15, approximately 30 feet. In photograph 22, 20 feet. In photograph 30, 15 feet. In photograph 38, 10 feet. In photograph 43, 8 feet. In photographs 44 through 47, the figure was not visible, gone. After photograph 43, when it had reached approximately 8 feet from where I'd been standing, it disappeared from the remaining 4 frames. Sven said, where did it go? I looked at photographs 44 through 47 carefully. In photograph 47, the last image from the session, taken at approximately 1 p.m. when we were finishing up, there was no figure between the stones. But the shadow on the ground beside the stone I'd photographed was wrong. Not the stone's shadow. The stone's shadow was correct for 1 p.m. September light, a different shadow, cast by something standing immediately beside the stone, immediately beside me. When I had taken the last photograph, I've sent the photographs to 3 people with expertise in photographic analysis. The first 2 came back with the expected conclusion. Figure visible in multiple frames. Could be a person present during the session. The photographer may simply not have noticed. The third analyst was more thorough. He examined the figure's shadow across all 47 frames. He said, the shadow is inconsistent with the figure. I said, what do you mean? He said, a person standing in that position, in that light at those times of day, would cast a shadow of a specific length and direction. The figure's shadow in your photographs doesn't match what a physical person would cast. I said, so the figure isn't casting the right shadow? He said, the figure isn't casting any shadow. He said, whatever is in your photographs doesn't have a shadow. I said, what does that mean? He said, it means it wasn't physically there when you photographed it. He said, which means it was there some other way. I've been back to that cemetery once since, with Sven, in October, 2 months after the session. We stood at the spot where photograph 43 had been taken, where the figure had been 8 feet from my camera. I looked at the stones around me. The specific stones the figure had been standing between in the earlier photographs. Old stones, 1,830 seconds and 1,840 seconds. The oldest section, I don't know who they were. I don't know what was in those graves that wanted its photograph taken. What I know is that whatever it was, it moved from 60 feet to 8 feet across 42 photographs, consistently, purposefully, frame by frame, and it knew when to stop. Before 44, before 45, before 46, before 47. When the shadow it didn't have was beside my foot, it knew exactly how close to get. Before I could see it, before I could feel it, before the shadow on the ground was close enough to touch my shoes. I still do preservation photography. I still document Appalachian cemeteries. But now, when I get home from a session, before I do anything else, before I eat or change or call anyone, I open the photographs and I look behind the stones. Every one, before I let myself believe I was alone out there. 2 in, 1 more to go. If this is what you come here for, the stories that don't resolve, the things in these mountains that don't have clean explanations, hit subscribe right now. Every week, more of this. And drop a comment. Tell me which of the first 2 stories is going to follow you tonight. The stone that keeps turning toward the family member most recently buried, or the figure in 47 photographs that got 8 feet away before it stopped. Because story 3 is the one I find most disturbing, because it speaks. I want to start with the sounds themselves, because nothing I say afterward lands properly unless you understand what they were like. They were not dramatic. That's the thing that kept me from acting on them sooner, kept me from telling Celia about them for nearly 3 weeks, kept me in the specific place of deciding every morning that it was probably nothing, and then lying awake the following night listening to it again. If the sounds had been dramatic, if they'd been loud or shrieking or anything that a horror movie would give you, I'd have acted immediately. But they were quiet. The specific kind of quiet that makes you wonder if you're actually hearing something or if your brain is pulling sound out of silence the way it sometimes does in the dark. That wondering, that uncertainty, is what let them go on for 40 nights before I did anything about it. My name is Langston. I'm 51. Celia's my wife. We've lived on our Kentucky Appalachian property for 15 years, 12 acres, a farmhouse, a barn, and adjacent to the southeastern edge of our land, separated by a stone wall and a line of old cedars, a pre-Civil War family cemetery. The cemetery predates our ownership by about 150 years. It belongs to a family trust that maintains it. We have nothing to do with its management. It simply exists on the boundary of our land, a fact of the property we accepted when we bought it and have generally had no issue with. It's a peaceful place in daylight, 14 stones in the old section, all pre-1865. 8 stones in the newer section, 1,880 seconds through 1,940 seconds. The old section is what started making sounds. The first night I heard it was a Tuesday in October. I'd gotten up for water at approximately 2 a.m. Celia was asleep. I was in the kitchen and the window faces the southeastern edge of the property, faces the stone wall and the cedar line, and beyond it, the cemetery. A sound, low, rhythmic, barely above the threshold of hearing. The kind of sound you're not sure you're hearing until you hold your breath and the sound continues without the help of your breathing rhythm. Not a voice, not music, not anything I could immediately classify. A pattern, repeating. I stood at the kitchen window for maybe 5 minutes. The sound continued, the same pattern, the same rhythm, low and soft and coming from the direction of the old section. Then it stopped. I went back to bed. I didn't tell Celia. It came back the following Thursday. Same time, 2 a.m. approximately. Same quality, same pattern. I stood at the window for longer this time, 20 minutes. The pattern was consistent, it didn't vary. The same sequence of sounds at the same intervals, repeating without change. I want to describe the pattern as precisely as I can, because the pattern is the whole story. It was grouped, sounds in groups, with a pause between each group. The groups varied in length. Some groups had 2 sounds, some had 4 or 5, some had 3, but each group had a specific internal rhythm, a specific number of sounds at specific intervals, and then a longer pause, and then the next group, I listened to it for 20 minutes and I couldn't identify it. I went back to bed. I started recording on night 5. I set up a directional microphone at the kitchen window, the best audio equipment I had in the house, and I let it run from midnight until 4 a.m. I did this for 40 consecutive nights. Not every night produced sound. Some nights were silent. But over the 40-night period, 23 nights produced audio, 23 recordings, all showing the same pattern, the same groups, the same internal rhythms, the same pauses. I listened to all 23 recordings, and I couldn't identify what was producing the pattern or what the pattern meant. I told Celia. She listened to the recordings. She said, "It's organized." I said, "Yes." She said, "Not random." I said, "Not remotely random." She said, "What is it?" I said, "I don't know." She said, "Who would know?" I found Dr. Bird through the University Extension Service, a sound engineer and acoustic researcher who had done work on environmental audio analysis, natural sound patterns, the kind of research that distinguishes signal from noise in ambient recordings. I sent him 3 of the 23 recordings without explanation. I said I had unidentified sounds from adjacent to an old family cemetery and wanted help classifying what was producing them. He came back to me 12 days later. He said, "I've analyzed your recordings." I said, "What's producing the sounds?" He said, "I can't tell you what's producing them. I can tell you what the pattern is." I said, "What is it?" He said, "The groups you're hearing, the variable length groups with specific internal rhythms, are corresponding to something. The lengths of the groups, the number of sounds in each group correspond to a sequence." I said, "What sequence?" He was quiet for a moment. And before I answer that, I need to ask you something. How many stones are in the old section of the cemetery? I said, 14. He said, "And do you have access to the burial records, the specific order in which those 14 people were buried?" I said, "The family trust maintains the records. I could probably get them." He said, "I'd like you to do that before I tell you what I've found." It took me 2 weeks to get the burial records from the trust. The trust had documentation going back to the cemetery's establishment in the 1,820 seconds. The records listed every interment in chronological order, every person, every date, 14 burials in the old section spanning 1,823 to 1,861. I sent the records to Dr. Bird. He called me the following day. He said, "Langston." I said, "Tell me." He said, "The groups in your audio recordings correspond to the names on those 14 stones." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Each group of sounds has a length and an internal rhythm that corresponds to a specific name. The number of sounds in the group corresponds to the number of syllables in the name. The internal rhythm corresponds to the natural spoken rhythm of the name." He said, "Group 1, 2 sounds at a specific interval corresponds to a 2-syllable name." He read me the first name on the burial record, 2 syllables. He said, "Group 2, 3 sounds at a different interval corresponds to a 3-syllable name." He read me the second name, 3 syllables, the rhythm he described matching the natural emphasis of the name. He went through all 14. All 14. The 23 nights of recordings were the cemetery's 14 names, in burial order, from 1,823 to 1,861, repeating. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time. Then I said, "What's producing it?" He said, "I don't have an answer for that." I said, "The sound is coming from the old section of the cemetery at 2 a.m. in a pattern that corresponds to the names of the people buried there, in the order they were buried, repeating." He said, "Yes." I said, "And you can't tell me what's producing it?" He said, "I can tell you what I've eliminated. Wind patterns, insect activity, structural sounds from nearby buildings, all insufficient to produce a pattern this specific and this consistent across 23 recordings." He said, "What I have left is a pattern that corresponds precisely to the 14 names in that cemetery." He said, "I can tell you what the pattern says." He paused. He said, "I can't tell you who's saying it." The sounds have continued. Not every night, but regularly, and always the same sequence. 14 names in burial order, repeating. Celia and I have made a decision that I want to be honest about. We've decided not to investigate further. Not because we can't, because we've decided that the sounds are what they are, and that whatever is producing them has been producing them for whatever time this has been happening before. We noticed it in October 2 years ago, and we've decided that the right response to 14 people announcing themselves by name in the ground next to our land is to let them announce themselves. We don't go to the old section at night. We don't play the recordings. We don't try to understand what it costs to be one of the 14 names in a pre-Civil War Kentucky cemetery, calling out across 170 years of being under the ground. What we do is this. On the nights the sounds start, we get up, we stand at the kitchen window, and we listen all the way through. All 14 names, from the beginning to the end, because whatever they are, whatever they want, whatever's saying their own names in their burial order into the Kentucky night at 2 a.m. means to them, the least we can do is hear it. The least we can do is be there when they call. 3 cemeteries, a headstone that is rotated 3 times in 35 years, always turning to face whoever was most recently buried beside it, each time pointing toward family. A preservation session where 47 photographs showed a figure moving steadily closer across the session, shadowless, getting to 8 feet before the last 4 frames, the final photograph showing only a shadow that couldn't belong to anything visible. And 14 names in a pre-Civil War Kentucky cemetery, calling themselves out into the night in burial order from 1,823 to 1,861, repeating until someone stands at the window and listens to all of them. Here's what I can't stop thinking about. All 3 of these require something of the living. The moving stone requires the living to notice, to investigate, to understand that the direction the stone faces means something. The figure in the photographs requires the living to look carefully at the images afterward, to see what the eye missed in person. The night sounds require the living to hear, to record, to analyze, and then to stand at the window and listen all the way through. In every case, the dead are not just being present, they are communicating. The stone says, "I am oriented toward her." The figure in the photograph says, "I was here, I was close, I wanted you to know." The 14 names say, "We are still here, we have names, hear them." The Appalachian Mountains are full of old cemeteries, full of people who've been under the ground for a very long time. And I think they have spent a very long time learning how to say so. And the only question is whether the living are paying close enough attention to hear it. Check your photographs when you get home from the cemetery. Look behind the stones, every one. And if you hear something at 2 a.m. from the old section, stand at the window, listen all the way through. They've been waiting long enough. Good night.